Hello, Internet. I'm Christian Sandvig. I will be your moderator for the next hour here at this InfoSpeaks discussion event. I'm delighted to bring you a panel of three extremely distinguished professors. Their expertise ranges from politics to computer science. It includes national security, civil rights, social media. It's a fantastic panel. Our plan for today is that I'm going to, in a moment, allow the panelists to introduce themselves. Then we will have a little discussion amongst ourselves, just to be sure that we're warmed up for you, the audience. You can then submit your questions, and we will turn this into an audience-driven Q&A for the remainder of the time. So let me begin by saying, if each of the panelists could introduce themselves briefly. Ariel, could you begin?
Hi, I'm Ariel Hasell. I'm an assistant professor of communication and media here at the University of Michigan, and my research focuses on social media and news, um, and specifically looking at how people's use of social media shapes their perceptions of news environment, including their skepticism of news, their trust in institutions, and their cynical attitudes towards politics.
Thank you. Barbara, could you go next?
Sure, thanks so much. Glad to be with you. My name's Barb McQuade. I'm a professor from practice at the law school. I focus on criminal law, data privacy, and national security. And I come at this problem from a national security perspective. I spent most of my career as a federal prosecutor, and I see information warfare as one of the greatest threats to our national security.
Thank you, Barbara. Ceren?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Ceren Budak. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information, also in computer science and Center for Political Studies at University of Michigan. I am a computer scientist by training, and I'm using large-scale observational data and sometimes large-scale experiments to study questions related to political communication. So some of these relate to misinformation, which is why I'm here.
Thank you so much. So I'm Christian Sandvig. I'm the moderator for this event. I'm a professor at the School of Information and also in the Center for Political Studies. I'm also the director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing, or ESCAPE, which is a co-sponsor of this event along with the School of Information. So at the outset, I'd like to thank the ESCAPE Center and the School of Information for making this event possible. So I think we should start with a very basic question that maybe you can help with. What's the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Who wants to take it on?
Well, I can take a stab at it if you like. Others
Please.
may have an interest in chiming in as well. The Department of Homeland Security actually defines disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation to be three different things. I think in popular media, we see the terms used interchangeably, and I don't know that that's wrong, but under the DHS definition, disinformation is the deliberate use of false claims to advance an agenda. And it's more than just a lie. It is a lie that includes what's called reflex control, the desire to produce an emotional response. That's disinformation. Misinformation is its unwitting cousin. When we hear something that is false or we read something that is false and we believe it to be true and then we repeat it, we are propagating misinformation. Sometimes Russia refers to those who spread misinformation as useful idiots. We hear something we believe to be true and we are advancing someone else's agenda. And then malinformation is the use of accurate information, but again, to address some bad purpose to advance an agenda. So one example of malinformation, for example, was when Russia hacked into the Democratic National Committee in 2016 and stole emails, and then waited until an opportune moment to publish those emails. They were accurate, they were true, but they depicted some of the members of the Democratic Party in an unflattering light. And so that was a malignant use of accurate information or malinformation.
Thank you, Barbara. That's very helpful. Does anyone want to contribute to this definition, or should we let Barbara's definition stand here? What do you think?
I think that was a really excellent definition.
Great. Well, now that we've covered a little bit of just the basics, how concerned should we be about the current situation? I mean, we're counting down the days to the election, and I think there's a sense that technology has enabled all kinds of new threats and new problems. So how worried should we be right now? Is it the case where we've seen some of this before and now we're prepared for it? Or is it rather that every day is a new kind of attack and we're not ready? Does anybody want to give us an introductory threat assessment?
I guess maybe
See some
I
grimacing.
will right. So maybe I think I heard two questions, one of them is how concerned should we be? And I think the second question was the role of technology. So I think that to me those are separate questions. And when we're thinking about how concerned should we be, I am quite concerned about misinformation, but perhaps not necessarily in the sense of worrying about misinformation that's spreading on platforms as much as I'm concerned about the norms that allow political elite to spread such information. And so that's, I guess, maybe the first point. The second point is maybe connected to this role of technology. That's a very open debate, at least in sort of computational parts of this field. And that to me is a causal type of question. And there I think the answers are mixed in terms of the role that technology is playing as opposed to other actors in the space. But maybe I'll start with that and let the others chime in, and happy to elaborate more as well.
Ariel or Barbara?
Yeah, I'll step in. I mean, as far as the role of technology is that most of us are consuming political information in these digital environments, whether it's on social media or other types of platforms. And we're just inundated with a lot of information, and it comes in. It's not just the amount of information, but the varied formats. There's audio, visual, there's, like TikTok videos, screenshots. It's very cacophonous. It comes at us and it doesn't necessarily always make sense. And so very little of that we know is actually disinformation. It doesn't mean it's all good information. A lot of it's biased or incomplete or things like that. But what happens is when we're consuming information in these digital environments, it becomes very difficult and cognitively effortful to evaluate that information and decide what might be true or not. And so I think part of the issue with consuming information in these platforms is that a lot of people revert to skepticism as default. So we have this sort of two sides of this problem of disinformation. One is that people might believe false things, but also that people aren't believing true things because they've decided that the safe thing to do here is to just not trust anything.
Yeah, I guess the one glimmer of hope I will give is that I think as time goes on, we will find ways to address these problems. At least we have the power as in a democracy to address these problems. I think we have the power to address some of these issues through regulation, not by preventing content, by perhaps limiting the immunity that social media platforms currently enjoy, to provide exceptions for their own conduct, like the algorithms they use and the data, private data that they scrape and the bots that they permit, the advertising revenue they collect. So I think that there are ways that we might be able to mitigate some of what we are bombarded with. And I completely agree with Ariana that we are bombarded with all of these things. But I also think we can do some things from the consumer side in terms of building our own resilience and learning to recognize some of these things. There was a time when people watched movies in the earliest days of moving pictures, when they saw a train coming down the tracks at them, and they would dive to the floor or run out of the back of the theater because they were afraid it was the real thing. And I think that now, of course, we watch a movie and we keep eating our popcorn when we see something like that. I think that we are going to learn to build some resilience against some of these false things. Of course, the harm is that people become so skeptical that they don't believe anything. But I think that if we have, good practices of how we can investigate to determine whether something is accurate, to be, skeptical, but to work to verify that which is true. I think that although I think efforts at disinformation are going to continue to come at us, I think there's some ways that we can reduce the harms.
Thank you, Barbara. Maybe we could leave the legal immunity, put that on hold for just a second. I'm curious about the earlier part of your response and what other people said. I mean, we heard that this was actually about norms, and then we heard a little bit about cynicism or effort. I mean, are these the only norms? What norms should we be concerned about particularly, did you mean, Ceren? Or, I mean, is there so a lot of people tell this as a technology story, and we just heard maybe not. So is there more to that?
Maybe I'll elaborate very quickly on what I mean. I mean, again, political norms as to what degree you can bend the truth. I guess this perhaps has a long history that perhaps politicians do bend the truth in some ways, but we are in an era where there are explicit lies that are being uttered, by people who have really large audiences and following. So that's the component that I was talking to. So, for instance, you can look at today. There are some polls that are out there. They're looking at like 1/3 of the U.S. Population believes that the 2020 election was illegitimate. So you look at that result. You might try to say, well, it's the technology, which might be playing a role. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is the more long-running, enduring, parts of our political system, political elite being a part of it, and traditional media being another, that might be also playing a really important role here. So that's where it's thinking about what is the cause of our societal issues. I am generally skeptical of putting everything on technology. Of course, medium is the message in some ways, right? It is, they do shape the way that we interact with each other. But it's only one part of the component, and we build technologies that serve, our values, and perhaps that's where we should be starting from.
And
Thank you. I mean, yeah, Ariel, please.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say it's true that in political science, there's a long history of knowing that voters do tend to take cues from their political elites. So when the sort of political norms of elite behavior, whether it's the incivility or the flat out lying, becomes sort of normalized among the political elite, that translates to the public and their supporters. That if this is happening at the elite level, it sort of makes it okay to occur at the everyday level as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I wonder if we can't nudge the leaders. We have an election, we have an opportunity to choose a leader who will traffic in disinformation, and maybe one who does not. But short of that, I wonder if we can't have more grassroots shaping of norms as well. I'm often struck by the change I've seen in my lifetime to attitudes about drunk driving. There was a time when I was very young when people shrugged their shoulders about drunk driving and say, what are you going to do? People are going to stop at the bar on the way home from work. And, sometimes accidents happen. And then mothers of victims got mad and said, this is unacceptable. And so they founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving. As a result of their powerful lobbying efforts, we saw laws passed making it more consequential to engage in drunk driving. We saw judges taking it up. If they want to be elected, they had to have harsh penalties for drunk drivers. And then we saw all of the billboards talking about the loss. Emma was killed by a drunk driver, to bring it home to people. Driver's education now includes a component of drunk driving and the hazards and the very serious consequences for it. I wonder if we couldn't adopt, other things that we think are important through that kind of grassroots efforts to shame those who engage in traffic in disinformation. It's hard to reach people when the perpetrators are in Russia, but when they're our own leaders, political elites, as Ariel refers to them, if we stop voting for them or we shame them or we say this is immoral and socially unacceptable, at some point they have to follow our lead. And so I would advocate for, all of us being the change we want to see in the world.
All right, I'm hearing, that this is more about an information ecosystem and that we have norms that we should seriously consider. But picking up on Barbara's last comment, I mean, when we see the kinds of warnings coming out of the intelligence community, they're not warning us about our own politicians. I understand why they're not, but they're saying you have to be alert about campaigns coming from Russia and Iran. So is there a role for norms about the behavior of sovereign states? For example, I mean, in history, certain kinds of things that now we see routinely might be an act of war because they would be interfering in the internal operations of another country, or they would be very provocative. Whereas now it just seems like the norm is that we will have ongoing disinformation campaigns from other countries trying to destabilize our elections.
I would
Can
be,
done?
yeah, I guess I would be curious what Barbara has to say here, because I don't know national security well enough, but I'm guessing that the actually state propaganda or information operations actually have a long history. It might just be that right now, again, with new technologies, there are new ways that that they are practicing that. But so I guess maybe this was just a sort of coming in to say, yeah, Barbara, tell us.
Yeah. At this point, there's not international treaties on this. The people who traffic in disinformation tend to be our adversaries and not our allies, like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. There is reason to think it's quite possible that the United States engages in similar activity with foreign countries. I don't know whether we do or we don't. But just as we entered into nuclear arms agreements with the Soviet Union in the SALT talks, if we determine that disinformation is such a dangerous weapon in society, perhaps that is something that we could negotiate, some sort of treaty that says, we agree to stand down and not do this to each other. It seems like, a respect for each other's sovereignty would require nothing less. But I don't know that, we have the ability at this point to stop them other than through what we saw in the 2016 election, which was criminal charges against Russia for conspiracy to defraud the United States by interfering in the fair administration of elections.
I mean, admittedly, I don't think anyone would want to defend the statement that the United States has never interfered in another country's election. Like, I don't think that would be something we would be able to defend. But I think it's interesting to think of this as something that could be addressed by diplomacy or international treaty. What about science? I mean, that's another dimension of this. So at the last Nobel Prize summit, there was a new organization formed called the International Panel on the Information Environment. It was modeled after the same panel that we're familiar with, or maybe familiar with, about climate change. And the idea is that perhaps political science or social science or something has some role to play in saying this is what we need to have a functioning information environment. And it could be a functioning democracy would be another way to think about it. And so maybe the experts on that can help promulgate standards. I mean, it's not quite the same solution as international treaties. I mean, do you think, what's the role of political science, social science, computer science? Does anyone want to take that?
I mean, maybe as a computer scientist, I can take that angle, which is when we're thinking about at least misinformation that's spreading through platforms. Partly platforms can be responsible for spread of misinformation, but partly they're also a great way to identify, measure things as they're happening, and be able to basically deliver interventions. And the biggest roadblock for work like that is platforms that are unwilling to share data or their experimentation platforms.
Can you say an example of what you mean by an intervention?
So, I mean, platforms have done versions of these, especially after the 2016 election. There were, and leading up to the 2020 election, there were a lot of concerns about misinformation. And platforms had, for instance, flags. They would flag, content that is likely to have misinformation. They had interventions of keeping people out of platforms. So when you have these kinds of interventions, not only can you change people's information and environments, but also can actually measure the impact that has, right? So we talk a lot about the impact of misinformation, but the kind of people who consume misinformation might have other correlates that might be related to their attitudes and behaviors already. So if you take out that one but one piece of problematic content or channel, we want to be able to understand what's the impact. So if you have access to these platforms and can maybe not only deliver interventions, but also measure how people change their behavior, maybe if you can, reach out to those folks through surveys to measure their attitudes, then you can really start to understand what kinds of change channels are most likely to be effective. So that would be, I think, from a technology and computer science perspective, a potential, I guess, the possibility in terms of what we can do with platforms and experimentation and measurement.
Interesting. I mean, it seems like if it worked really well, you could have a potential for a kind of inoculation or repair or something like that.
Yeah. And researchers do that in small scales and small labs here and there, but it's becoming more and more challenging as platforms are closing up their, data access channels, or they rarely ever had ways to collaborate for experimentation. So, but these venues are becoming fewer and fewer, which is really unfortunate.
Well, that might bring us back to the role of regulation. But before we go there, Ariel, do you want to take on this question of if social scientists ruled the world, if they were listened to the way the climate science, well, that doesn't sound quite right. Well, anyway, if they were listened to, what would they say about a healthy information environment?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And so I think Ceren's point about, social science right now is very limited in what we can actually know about what goes on in these platforms, because most of them are pretty unwilling to do collaborations and data sharing in really meaningful ways. And so that's sort of a big concern. There's other things that we, thinking from a social science side, of ways to sort of share good information. So a lot of platforms like Instagram and Threads and TikTok have made platform decisions to suppress news and political conversations as a way of sort of not taking a stand in elections. Of course, that itself is very much a stand. And so these platforms are major ways people get exposed to political information. And so suppressing news on these platforms makes it so that other types of political content, and where the political messages may be more indirect or more hidden, makes that type of information thrive. So that's one thing, like providing people easier and more convenient access to news would be a really important step. But a lot of platforms have decided actually our solution is to suppress news, and because they don't want to be involved in politics, they don't want to be accused of those mistakes. So that's sort of one thing we could think about is how to make those news environments be willing to either work with, collaborate, maybe even do some profit sharing with organizations that are committed to truth as best as possible and have editorial practices and journalistic standards.
That's fantastic. I feel like we have some health metaphors floating around, because I earlier said inoculation, we've heard about experimentation, but now it's kind of nutrition. It's like you have to be sure that you're getting a steady diet of truth, and that might be an important remedy. We kind of jumped into remedies before we talked about the risks and the harms too much, but I think we should just keep going. So earlier, Barbara had mentioned, I believe she was referring to Section 230 when she mentioned that one thing that we could do to combat disinformation would be to limit the immunity enjoyed by the platforms at present. Do you think you could say more about that, particularly for people who don't know anything about that area?
Yep. So currently, the social media platforms are governed by Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996. This statute is sometimes referred to as the 26 words that invented the internet. And because it gave them immunity from legal liability from civil actions. So if somebody posts something online that is defamatory, you might be able to sue the poster, but you can't sue the platform. And in 1996, it probably made sense to do that. Their goals at the time were to foster innovation and creativity and investment. And so if you could free these platforms from having to look over their shoulder and be worried about criminal or civil legal liability, it would free them to be bold and fearless and take risks. Well, we find ourselves now almost 30 years later, and things certainly have changed. And using the same rules that applied then now really probably doesn't make any sense. It's a little like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. When it's small, it's adorable, and you don't really need to worry too much about what the rules are. But at some point, it grows into a man-eating predator. And I think it's time to reflect on whether we can still manage the monster we've created with the laws that we passed almost 30 years ago. And so I don't know that we need to completely eliminate that immunity, but I would suggest we think about amending it. Because with the immunity, the social media platforms are essentially saying, look, we're just like a utility. We're just putting the lines out there, and it's these other people who are using our platforms to say things. We don't have the capacity to monitor what's there, and we shouldn't have to because we're just laying the lines. It's like if you want to stand on your soapbox and give a speech in the town square, we're like the person who built the soapbox, right? We don't know how it's going to be used. Some will use it for good, some will use it for ill, but we can't foresee that. So you can't sue the soapbox maker because somebody stands on it and defames another person. That's the way they say it. On the other hand, what they also say is that when lawsuits are brought about their content moderation policies for violating the First Amendment rights of the speakers, they say, hey, we're like any other publisher, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and we should get the same protections they get to have editorial discretion in making our own decisions. Well, I kind of want to say, which is it? Are you a utility or are you a publisher? Because you can sue the New York Times or the Washington Post if they publish something defamatory, even if it's just one of their writers who publishes it or who wrote it, if they're the ones who publish it. And so I think we are still having a hard time getting our heads around exactly how to think of social media platforms in terms of regulation. But I would submit that we start with baby steps by just doing some very modest regulation that maintains their liability for most things. But if we were to regulate them for the algorithms they use, that's the computer code that tells our accounts which content to elevate and prioritize and which content to demote. We don't really get to see what it is they're doing. There was a Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, a former data scientist, who resigned from Facebook because she disclosed in testimony to Congress that Facebook was deliberately manipulating the emotions of its users for profit. They would promote content that they believed would elicit an outrage in response, and they would demote more neutral content because the more outraged we were, the longer we would stay online, and the longer we stay online, the more they can charge advertisers. So outrage equals money for Facebook. Why can't we require disclosure of the algorithms? Or maybe if not to the public, to the FTC, which pre-clears the algorithms. Or if someone is harmed by something that they see online, they can sue for loss of life. Like, if somebody sees a video and decides to commit suicide as a result, maybe we make them responsible for their own conduct, those algorithms. In the same way, they are scraping our private data and selling it to data brokers, who in turn sell it to commercial entities as well as political operatives. And so we are micro-targeted with ads that deliberately seek to nudge us and change our behavior because they know so much about us. Again, maybe making our buy-in of and sharing our personal information a more meaningful consent than we currently have, or even prohibiting certain sales of our private data. Removing the bots that are online and create the impression that posts are more popular than they really are because these bots are liking and sharing and promoting some of the false content. So those are just some ideas. There are probably other ways we could do this, but I'm thinking modest amendment to the legal immunity would be a good place to start to see if there aren't some ways we could mitigate some of this disinformation.
Barbara, there's a lot there. I think that I'd love to hear the other panelists respond. I mean, particularly, so first of all, let's start with, I mean, is this the pro-regulation panel? Is everyone on board with the immunity proposal?
Well, I think it's a complicated issue because of the First Amendment, and I'm not a legal scholar, but people are allowed to say things online. People are allowed to say things you don't like online. But I do think that there are small ways, again, very modest things that we can ask these platforms to do in ways that are actually very, very consistent with our laws. And some other countries have started doing this. So in the UK, for example, just like the US, it is illegal for foreign entities to get involved in elections and buy advertising and do things like this. And so the UK said, Facebook, you're now legally responsible for political ads. You have to confirm that political ads in the UK are not coming from Russia, are not coming from the US or wherever, that these are entities that are producing the political ads are British entities, British companies, British organizations, people who have according to our laws, are allowed to buy this type of advertising and produce this type of advertising. And so that they say we have these laws on the books that foreign entities cannot interfere with our elections. And so we are going to hold you, Facebook, responsible for making sure that the content on there is that is relevant to these laws is being that you're vetting where this money is coming from and who is actually purchasing it. And that's going to be on you.
I mean, it's still only part of the ecology that you introduced us to earlier in the panel about maybe some of the problems are coming from our own politicians, as we heard from some of the other panelists. But we're getting quite a few questions now. So I'm just maybe we could move to a more rapid fire response, but I'd love to follow up on some of the points opened by Barbara. Ceren, responding to Barbara, I mean, is algorithm transparency the answer? That was a particular targeted intervention. I mean, is there something we should do about the algorithms?
Yeah, I think that's a great topic. And I think when we're thinking about transparency, the way that I imagine this is sort of more like input versus output focused transparency. So some of those are like what is happening on these platforms versus what is it that they are inputting? Like what is the algorithm itself trying to achieve? So I think that when it comes to the output, for instance, somebody saw a video that affected them, that's a little bit more challenging, right? Because it is like partly what we have on platforms is also what people have demand for and what they're putting on the platform, as opposed to what the platform is intentionally shifting people towards. When it comes to if we can have standards for more of these inputs, like what is it that the algorithm is, for instance, if it's indeed you can identify the degree to which it's giving more air to toxic or misinformation content, if that's sort of embedded in their algorithms, that would be a useful type of transparency to have. The issue with that one is that these systems are really quite complex. I think there was when Elon Musk came into power, it was like, here's our system, and it's a hairball. So partly it's I think it's a great goal to have, and I think it's a great going back to one of the points that you were making before, for is like scientists coming together to create standards before we regulate, because it seems like to me right now there's not enough agreement to say, here's the exact change that we want to be able to regulate these platforms correctly. So if we have some of that, I think that would be, we have standards of like, here are the kinds of things that you need to produce as a platform to say, we are going to be looking at that. And if they are really focused on potential harms to the population, I think that would be a good improvement for, I guess, where we are.
It's a big topic. I recall a few years ago, legal scholar Frank Pasquale said that if you are building a system that's too complicated to explain, then it's too complicated to be allowed to exist. I don't know that I'm not agreeing with that statement. It's a provocative statement that drew a lot of attention at the time. But I mean, this is an ongoing debate about how you would make transparency work. I mean, so we have questions in the YouTube chat and we have pre-submitted questions. So I'd like to bring in some of the audience here. We have quite a few now. Some of them do repeat each other. So I'm going to kind of summarize and merge maybe if the audience will forgive me. I mean, just to keep on the topic of regulation and transparency, I mean, are there other things that we should be doing in that vein? So one of the questioners particularly talked about like, can we fix this with labeling? I mean, is it realistic that we're going to be able to detect, I mean, AI reliably, and then we're going to be, deepfakes are going to be, you know, screened and labeled, and is that going to work? I mean, is that a realistic thing that we should be working toward? It seems like it doesn't get you the evil actors, right? Yeah. I mean, unless you automatically can detect it all. Do we have a position on that? Panel?
Well, I'll just say this. I think you can at least stop campaigns from engaging in deep fakes. So, for example, some states are starting to pass laws that say if you use deep fakes for election ads, you must label them as such. Same with some, deep fake, non-consensual sexual material. It's not going to solve the whole problem, as you say, because it will only apply. The only people who will comply are those who want to play by the rules and are worried about the consequences of failing to do so. So a political campaign, maybe political action committees, and I think that could clean up some of it. So it solved part of the problem. But I still worry that, when we have U.S. laws, it's difficult for us to get to international actors, especially if those actors are hostile foreign adversaries, as opposed to countries with whom we have treaties. And so if you've got malicious actors in Russia or China or other places, I don't know that labeling requirement is going to work unless it is somehow, and this is beyond my expertise, maybe you folks can chime in here, if there is a technical solution to detecting the AI generated content and labeling it that way. I know there is a researcher at U of M Dearborn who is working on using AI to detect the use of AI so that he can detect, he's working on audio recordings, and he's used Joe Biden's voice as his sample set. He can detect fake uses of Joe Biden's voice. Now, can we scale that kind of a tool so that anything that appears on any of the social media platforms immediately gets labeled as utilizing AI or as a deepfake? That would be phenomenal. I just don't know if the technical capacity is there.
Quite a few of the questions that we've received and our own conversations imply automation might be the solution to some of this. Like it's getting even the earlier proposals, like Ariel was saying, identifying the nationality and referring to the UK law. I mean, everything that we've talked about in some way could be made easier or harder with technology, but what are the prospects? I mean, so even something as simple as, is this true? It seems like it might not be as straightforward as it sounds.
That is the hardest question, actually, I think, right? So I think it is easier to identify whether something is AI generated because that's a technology problem. I think it becomes a harder problem when it's a socio-technical problem. So when it comes to determining whether something is truthful or not, like knowledge is socially constructed. We don't agree. And even if you look at, for instance, even fact checkers. So we had a study a couple of years ago when we looked at these like lists of domains that were published by different fact checkers as like producing misinformation. it was, I think maybe only 6% of domains were listed by all 5 lists that we looked at. 50% were like listed by only one, right? So even when you're looking at fact checkers, the agreement is not 100%. And for fact checkers, it's partly because of scale, right? It is like they can't look at everything. But even when they're looking at the same content, the agreement is not 100%. And when you go to the general public, it's even lower, because then you have all kinds of, you don't have as rigorous sort of processes that people follow to determine whether something is true or false. So that's why I think I go back to like technology is just this little slice of this problem. And when you have these automated classifiers, they can be great for scale, but they also come with their own biases as well. So I do remember the time when Facebook switched to using automated approaches, fully automated, and then people found biases of that, and there were like big controversies around that as well. So I don't think, unfortunately, that we have a bulletproof solution, because this is a social problem.
It's also more of an arms race metaphor when you have resources being poured into both sides of the technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Ariel, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, and I think I agree with everyone on the panel that this is a hard sort of ever evolving, hydra or whatever, but that we are getting better at it. And the other side of this that we haven't really talked about is this idea of like algorithmic literacy. Like, though social scientists are not necessarily able to access all of the black box data that that these platforms have, there are ways that we as a scientific community have been able to sort of audit those algorithms and see what is being shared. And so we know across all kinds of platforms, the people who post about politics are deeply, deeply abnormal, not in a derogatory way, but in just the sense that they're outliers. They are not the normal, the average American is not doing this. So the people who are posting are systematically very different. They tend to be deeply involved in politics and tend to be strong partisans, have very extreme political views. And so we know that the political content that ends up on social media is more partisan, is less likely to be accurate. It's also far more likely to be moralized. It reduces issues down to good or evil, and it's far more likely to be emotional. So sort of from audience's perspective, understanding what kinds of political information you're likely to come across, whether or not it's true or false, have its own sort of biases in it, and it's more likely to be different than the kind of political information you would come across if you were reading traditional news organizations or having discussions with friends about politics in outside social media environments. So sort of understanding how that information environment is systematically different is also really useful to people.
I mean, it sounds like we're hearing, or I'm hearing from you, a kind of, we must advance on all fronts. And one of these is literacy, which was also introduced by Barbara. Sorry, I'm not crediting the people in the chat, but I mean, we have a number of questions that also mention literacy, Sam being the first one. So definitely, it seems like we're not going to be able to rely on one solution here. We're going to have to do many. I feel like before we get too close to the end of our time together, I want to open something that many people seem to have questions about. What about generative AI? Like, what about new developments in producing artificial media? If you read some more panicky media reports about this, it's already gotten tremendously easier, but it's about to get even easier than that. So we're like at the edge of a cliff, if you believe them, where everything could be fake all the time and we don't know, and it's so easy to produce. How does that factor in? I think you'll have to answer it. A number of people want to know. Generative AI is in the questions here.
Okay, maybe I'll take a first stab, but I'm sure that others will
Fake
have
AI audio, deep fakes, new developments in deep fakes. What about Gen AI? How real is the threat from Gen AI? Yep.
Yeah. So I do remember going up to 2020, there were a version of this which was like deep fakes was a really big concern.
But they were harder to produce.
Yes, that's true. So it is a lot easier right now. So I think part of me is thinking there's this sort of new shiny object that we're focusing on versus the more prominent issues that we are seeing without, like, people can produce false information or propaganda without the use of these technologies. I guess I do go back to, again, these political elites, traditional media that actually have a wide audience. I really sort of really go back to my concern about them. But in terms of this makes it a lot easier to produce such content. For these kinds of issues, I'm actually more worried about maybe more local elections, cases where it's a lot, you can produce them at scale and just do it for people that are sort of maybe people are paying less attention to, and it is it's in the general elections. I feel like there's already enough out there that people who have power and money that can produce it without relying on generative AI. But I think that for those kinds of cases, it actually opens up new avenues, which is really concerning. And I'm also, whenever it comes to, again, like technology, it's more, again, the scale and cost that I'm thinking. And that might be, for instance, after the election, attacks on individuals that might be really concerning, right? So it might be more not just only false information that people are producing, but finding ways to identify people who are sort of responsible for counting of ballots, whatever, like people, basically attacks on individuals. Whenever you can either concentrate the consumption or the harm of something, that sort of gives it more power. So those kinds of things I am concerned about. But I'm partly glad that there is this like really big attention, because we are more vigilant, right? So there is a lot of people are worried about this. So hopefully we're sort of more paying more attention to it. So there's, that's like a sliver of hope, I guess, that we are concerned and looking out for things.
I mean, it's an interesting idea that the increasing affordability is going to produce problems down the election chain into local elections, and that's the next frontier. It's an interesting idea. Does anyone else want to respond to Gen AI or that idea?
Yeah, go ahead, Ariel.
I was going to say that it's a big question, and I suppose I am less concerned about any individual one piece of misinformation that Gen AI or deepfakes might sort of produce, because people are very aware of this and are very concerned about it, and widespread. When you look at big public opinion surveys about awareness of possible fake information, deepfakes, generative AI, people are concerned and understand. But my concern is that sort of the whole information environment, once we start really getting flooded with all of this deep fakes, these little pieces of misinformation, these giant fake pieces of information, the information that's slightly biased, that this bombardment of sort of bad information, that the biggest result is not necessarily that people are going to believe false things, although I am concerned about that too. That is a problem. But that people are just going to start tuning out and deciding this is too crazy, this is too difficult. And so I'm going to go watch Netflix because I can't make sense of any of this, and I'm pretty sure a lot of it is fake. So I think that's one of the really insidious things about mis and disinformation, is that a lot of it isn't designed to make you believe something that is false. A lot of it is designed to make you just want to tune out, to disengage and decide it's not worth your time or effort.
Yeah, but sometimes the truth does that as well. But definitely, yeah. Barbara,
I would just add, it's already really easy to make these fakes. I'm teaching a class this semester at the law school in deep fakes and disinformation, and we had a PhD student in computer engineering come over and show our class, including me, how to make a deep fake, and he had us use a handful of tools that are cheap. He said they're either free or cost less than $1 to make one of these things. And we made fake audio, we made fake video, we face swapped our own faces onto the body of a celebrity in very convincing looking things. So it's already incredibly easy. And so if it's generative, though, I worry that we could create something that we didn't even intend to create. And so that just boggles the mind what that could look like. And so I do think that there is the risk that Ariel speaks of, which is people just say everything on the internet is made up. You can't believe any of it, and so I'm just going to check out. And I think that cynicism is particularly true when it comes to elections. So if I'm just going on the internet to see funny cat videos and those generated by AI, that's fine. I'll stay there. But in terms of politics, and this is something that I researched in my book, that Putin traffics in Russia, the idea that I am going to convince people that there is no such thing as truth. I'm going to bombard you with conflicting claims so that you become very cynical that there is no such thing as truth. No one's honorable. No one has integrity. Everybody's a liar. Everybody's corrupt. And then to disengage from politics. I can't control any of those things anyway. So I'm just going to focus on the things I can control, like my family and my job. And I'm not going to worry about politics. And in a democracy, I think that is a particularly damaging state of mind. There's certainly people who believe that already and choose not to vote. But I worry that that sense of cynicism could really harm our democracy.
So yeah, I mean, I'm hearing from the panel that real risk is cynicism and disengagement. Absolutely. Also, an interesting idea there from Barbara. I don't know if the panel remembers, but there was a obscure scandal a few years ago where someone was using machine learning tools to produce YouTube videos that would get a lot of views that were targeted at children. And one of the interesting things about it is that in some ways you could say that it's not really clear who was the author of these videos because they were kind of psychedelic assemblages of things young children would watch, kind of Teletubby-like, if anyone is old enough to remember the Teletubbies. But if a lot of the web is produced automatically, or if we get, automatically produced journalism, I think Barbara's just introduced an interesting idea of political speech or messages about politics that don't necessarily have a malicious actor behind them. They have AI, and it's not exactly clear what direction that would go. So that's a fascinating idea. If I can just shift us again for our last couple of minutes, I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is that in the United States military establishment, the intelligence establishment released a warning just 1 week ago. And the warning is that if you're concerned about disinformation in the election, you should prepare to be much more concerned because they have indications, they believe, that hostile actors are saving up their ammunition to try and destabilize the United States information environment after the election. So in other words, they warned that people are preparing to release disinformation about how the election was rigged. And so one example was the earlier video that circulated that was false, showing apparently an election worker in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, tearing up early ballots for Harris and for Trump, and then leaving the Harris ballots to go through. So, which was shown to be false. But the warning says that we're just on the brink of this now. At the election, we're going to see an explosion, perhaps, of efforts to destabilize elections themselves. Excuse me. Does the panel have a comment on this situation? Is there anything that can be done? Is it the same problem? Do we not have to care about this? It seems like there are subtle differences here in the attacks and possibly the remedies, but I'm just the moderator.
Well, I do think that when it comes to those specific types of things, that is a case of where you have our foreign adversaries and bad actors this is a deliberate campaign to undermine democracy and undermine the United States. And I think, and I've seen some news organizations doing this and other advocacy groups doing this, but sort of warning about what we should expect in the days following the election, that we're really likely not going to know the results on the night of the November 5th because of different types of laws and early voting and
setting expectations and foreshadowing is key.
And yeah, foreshadowing, knowing that the few days after the election are likely going to be chaotic, but we probably will not have an actual answer until 3 or 4, maybe even more days after that. So setting those expectations, and I think it's going to be really a responsibility for news organizations on those news nights when they do the big shows of the calling and tracking every county, of making it really clear that we probably will not have an answer that night, and that's normal. And that's not an indication of a problem. It's an indication of us wanting to be very thorough with the way we count votes.
I mean, it seems like there's an elections administration piece here that's different from what we've talked about before, because I did see some media outlets were praising the Pennsylvania election authorities because they said if this were 4 years ago, you wouldn't have seen such a speedy response. They were ready. They knew that something was going to happen and it might be bad. And so there was a very fast debunking of the false video that said, that's not what the envelopes look like in Bucks County. The way this is shaped, it couldn't be real. I mean, it was very detailed and it happened fast. So, but I think, I mean, Ariel's proposal goes a little further. It's like warnings that like, it's an election. Get ready to see, ballots burning when they're not, or something, warning people about that particular disinformation threat.
Yeah,
Would
I think
someone else on the panel chime in?
I'll just say yes. I think warning and pre-bunking is really important. I know that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson here in Michigan has been taking some steps to pre-bunk some of the election lies that we might see coming down the road, so that people will be a little bit inoculated from those things. But what I do worry about is this feeding a narrative that stokes violence in our country. That there these false claims cause people who are angry about the outcome of the election to use it as a guise to, protest violently, to take up arms, to storm buildings. I do worry about all of that. And I think it really behooves our leaders to try to calm people's emotions. I don't know that we can count on all of our leaders to do that. But I think to the extent all of us can help desensitize or sensitize our friends and neighbors to be patient, wait for the vote count, and don't take the bait when we hear all of these things. That's the goal, is to get us attacking each other. And, if we can be calm, mature, and rational as we absorb this information, it will best serve our country.
And I guess even without the warnings seem really concerning, and it's likely that foreign states and entities would ramp up their.
I mean, not necessarily just foreign adversaries in this.
Exactly. So that was going to be what I was going to say, which is that I am worried, independent of that, given the narrative that has been building for a long time. And I think part of the issue is that all of these, like, we need to be vigilant, and our leaders need to prepare us. I think that will help to some extent, but I think it's again the kind of people who are likely to believe such cases of misinformation are probably not trusting some of these institutions to begin with. So there are some. I think there's an interesting sort of a study by Bernsky, I believe, where he's talking about these value of costly signals, which is that when the corrections are coming from people for whom it's like more costly to correct things, it's actually taken more put more weight on those kinds of things.
Is there an example?
I guess example was, for instance, I believe in his book, examples were, for instance, like McCain back in the day when he would correct misperceptions about Obama. So it's costly for him to do that. There were a couple of people who would have some sort of exactly. So unfortunately, I think those are the kinds of it's not just I can tell my friends let's be vigilant. The kind of people who are sort of ready to fight this might be in different information environments, and the people who have sort of weak ties to those communities, it's costly for them to engage in such sort of correction or vigilance kinds of preparation. But those are the kind of, I think, people we need to really think about what's at stake. It's not just an election; it's a democracy. So hopefully, some of those people will stay vigilant, and that will be in some ways helpful.
It sounds like we need I mean, I love that. It's not just an election, it's a democracy. And it sounds like we need a bipartisan approach, is one of the things that we're calling for here. I mean, we're at time. Does anybody want to close with a note of optimism? I mean, what's the thing that you're most positive about that we talked about? That if you had to pick one thing that you think is the solution, or a most promising solution, because we just said there's no one solution.
Well, I think the thing that's most promising is that we live in a democracy. We're going through a moment right now where the internet is still in its infancy and we're still sorting out how to treat it. Are they publishers, utilities, something else? And I think we'll get there, but we can't cede our power to others to tell us how to live with this. We have to think strategically, carefully, and use our power as a democracy to come at this problem through a multiple of ways, through regulation, through education and law and policy. And we can solve this problem. We've put a man on the moon. We can do anything if we have the political will to do it.
So we, the people, can address this with our representative government.
Yes.
Yeah. Closing one short thing. Ariel, Ceren?
It's hard to follow that. I guess mine was going to be much narrower and maybe less optimistic. But I guess one thing is that we are aware. So as we become aware of a problem and have the willingness to change it, we'll make hopefully progress over time. And we've seen that in after the 2016 election, there were quite a number of changes that happened. Some of them went back, so we need to be vigilant. But we are aware, and hopefully enough people who have the skills, expertise, and the willingness to do this can make a change here.
So yeah, we've made changes before. We're going to make them again. It's just that this is what elections are. It's an ongoing process. It's not a single crisis. Ariel, looks like
yeah, I think awareness of the issue of mis and disinformation and the way that we as a culture and community have really sort of adopt concern about this, I think is putting our guard on, and is reminding us that democracy is not so much a noun as a verb, but we have to sort of enact it all the time. And there's always going to be threats to the nation, and remembering to sort of keep our chin up, that disengagement is not a solution to this, and keep working through it. And keeping that optimism even when it doesn't feel like there is any.
That's nice. So the request was for something optimistic, and Ariel, in part, the response is optimism itself is what we're optimistic about, that it exists. So this
hope is a very powerful motivator.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So this was Voting While Misled, a panel discussion about social media, disinformation, and the election. I'm Christian Sandvig. I just want to close by thanking the University of Michigan School of Information Development and Alumni Relations for their work in coordinating this. And I hope to see you with our next Info Speaks. Actually, I won't be moderating that, but I hope to see you on the next Info Speaks. And thank you all for joining us.